The Contingency Guillotine, Pillar 6, 7.1. I hereby sentence objective morality to death for the crime of causing confusion and building cruel societies. No morality can be truly objective if it requires or is translated through an interpreter, for all translation and interpretation is contingent on a mind. Thus, all moral systems, including divine ones, are necessarily subjective. If a rock rolls into a rock and cracks it, that action is absent of all morality and judgment. Whereas a rock with a mind that intends to hit and crack another rock with a mind necessarily includes the interpretation of those minds, and morality clearly rears its head. 7.2. The illusion of objective morality. It is a comforting illusion that moral truths exist out there in the universe, eternal principles that are independent of any mind. Many cultures and philosophies cling to the idea of objective morality, believing that what is right or wrong has an absolute existence beyond human opinion. We speak of human rights as if they were cosmic laws, or of good and evil as if they were natural properties like gravity. This chapter begins by shattering that illusion. In reality, all morality is inextricably tied to minds, and cannot transcend the subjective frameworks that conscious beings create. If every thinking being were to vanish, concepts of good and evil would vanish with them. That simple fact reveals a profound truth. Morality does not exist independently of us. It lives and dies in the realm of consciousness. At its core, morality is about valuation judgments of what is good or bad, what ought to be done versus what ought not. And valuation requires a valuer. A world with no conscious beings contains no preferences, no purposes, and no values. It has facts, like mountains and stars and chemical reactions, but no morals. A universe devoid of minds would have no one to care if an action is right or wrong. This stark observation forms the heart of the contingency guillotine. Any moral claim, no matter how universal it sounds, must be processed and understood by a mind. No morality can stand apart from a consciousness to interpret it. The very moment we articulate a moral truth, we are performing an act of interpretation, with our minds assigning meaning and oughtness to a situation. Thus, morality is necessarily mind-dependent. The belief in an objective moral law floating out there in the ether is a myth. Like a phantom, it disappears upon close logical inspection. 7.3. No morality without minds. The contingency guillotine. The contingency guillotine is the decisive cut that separates imagined, objective morality from reality. It states plainly, if a moral truth requires any mind to recognize or apply it, then it cannot be truly objective. Objective truths, by definition, would hold true without any interpreter. For example, the statement 2 + 2 = 4 is a logical truth that does not need a human mind to make it true, even if no one were around to do the math. Combining 2 and 2 objects would still yield 4 objects. By contrast, consider a moral statement like killing is wrong. Is that true in the absence of any mind to conceive it? Without a mind, the concept of wrong has no meaning at all. The moral statement needs a thinker to evaluate a killing and label it wrong. Unlike a mathematical fact or a physical law, a moral principle has no reality of its own, apart from the valuations of conscious beings. Interpretation is the lifeblood of morality, and interpretation only happens in minds. The contingency guillotine cleanly severs morality from any claim of objectivity, just as a physical guillotine would sever the head, the mind, from the body of morality. Without the mind attached, moral truths bleed out. They cannot survive as objective, independent entities. Think of a legal system to illustrate this dependence. We can inscribe laws in stone or print them in law books, but those laws are nothing but idle marks and symbols, unless there are living beings to read, interpret, and enforce them. A law against theft has no effect or meaning if no one is there to uphold it. In the same way, a moral rule like be kind is powerless and void in a world without agents to be kind or to value kindness. Morality requires enforcers and adherents. Even a perfectly reasoned moral code would sit impotent without someone to act on it. All morality needs a mind to give it meaning and force. Another analogy is language. A dictionary full of words and definitions objectively exists as ink on paper, but without speakers to understand and use those words. The dictionary is a lifeless artifact. Language isn't objectively meaningful on its own. Its meaning exists only in the interaction with minds. The same is true of ethics. We can imagine the most perfect moral principles, but unless a mind grasps them and a will carries them out, they might as well not exist. This truth holds even if we extend beyond humans. Some might argue that a super-intelligent AI or some idealized rational machine could enforce objective morality without human bias. But any AI would still require initial programming, a set of rules or goals given to it by designers, which means human minds would have planted the seeds of its morality. The AI would then be interpreting those rules as it operates. It might do so more consistently or efficiently than a person, but it's still not a mind-independent morality. It's following instructions contingent on its creators. In short, no clever workaround escapes the need for a mind. If morality is being applied or evaluated at all, some cognitive framework is at play. The contingency guillotine leaves no exception. Any moral system reliant on an interpreter cannot be objective in the mind-independent sense. Whether the interpreter is a human jurist, an AI, or even a deity, as we'll see, the necessity of interpretation means the moral truth is contingent, not absolute. 7.4 Failed quests for objective morality. Over the centuries, philosophers and theologians have proposed various foundations for an objective moral order. These attempts all share one goal: to locate morality in something that does not depend on any individual's whims or cultural quirks. Perhaps, they argue, morality comes from pure reason, or from the decrees of a god, or from nature itself. Each of these proposals, however, ultimately fails to escape the guillotine's blade. No matter how lofty the source, if a moral law is to have any effect, a mind must still decide what it means, and that it ought to be obeyed. Let's examine some of the most notable of these attempted escapes, and why they falter. Rationalist ethics, Kantian duty. Immanuel Kant famously tried to derive an objective morality from reason alone, Kant 1998 billions. His categorical imperative instructs that we should act only according to maxims we could will, as universal laws. This sounds like morality built on pure logic, independent of particular human preferences. However, even Kant's framework cannot fly free of contingency. Rationality itself lives in minds. There is no abstract reason floating outside of thinkers. Moreover, rational people can and do reach different conclusions about moral duties. If pure reason truly yielded objective moral laws, all rational beings would logically arrive at the same set of moral rules, just as all mathematicians can agree on a proof. They don't. Kant's universal laws still require a rational agent to interpret a situation and apply the rule, and different minds may interpret the same rule differently. In the end, Kantian ethics smuggles in a hidden contingency. It assumes that reason has intrinsic moral authority. But why should reason alone demand moral respect? That premise itself isn't a product of reason. It's a value judgment by Kant, a mind, about reason's importance. Thus, Kantian ethics, for all its rigor, cannot provide a mind-independent morality. Its edicts are only meaningful within the context of reasoning beings, and even then they are subject to those beings' perspectives. A divine command, morality from God. Another classic claim is that morality is objective because it comes from a supreme being. Right is what God ordains, wrong is what God forbids. On the surface, this seems to anchor morality in something ultimate and external to humans. Yet divine command theory encounters the same fundamental contingency problem. First, if one says that God simply interprets a moral law that exists beyond him, then even God is playing the role of interpreter, and we have to ask, who set up that higher law? If, on the other hand, God creates moral law by divine decree, then morality is contingent on God's will. It could have been otherwise had God willed differently, so it's not an absolute constant, but rather a chosen standard, chosen by a divine mind, no less. Furthermore, humans who follow divine moral codes are still interpreting God's will. Holy books and commandments do not speak for themselves. Believers must read them, consider context, resolve ambiguities, and sometimes even debate what God really meant. If a moral law were truly objective in the strong sense, everyone would grasp it in the same way without need for interpretation or endless commentary. Instead, religious moral teachings have spawned thousands of sects and conflicting doctrines, all evidence that even supposedly God-given morality is far from clear-cut or universally self-evident. The fact that people kill and conflict over God's absolute moral word shows just how subjective their understanding of that word is. Divine morality, then, either reduces to God's subjective morality, the universe according to him, or to an inscrutable higher law that not even believers can agree upon without mental interpretation. In both cases, it fails to be human independent and unequivocal. A nature and biology, moral naturalism, could morality be objective in the sense of being derived from nature or evolution? Some philosophers and scientists argue that because certain behaviors promote survival and well-being, morality is basically an extension of natural laws or biological imperatives. For example, they might claim that human beings have evolved compassion and cooperation because those traits helped our ancestors thrive. Therefore, morality is grounded in our biology. It's certainly true that our evolutionary history influences our sense of right and wrong, but influence is not the same as objective justification. Nature produces all sorts of behavior such as competition, violence, altruism, and everything in between. Saying morality is what's natural just begs the question, whose nature? Which natural drives? We inevitably cherry-pick aspects of nature that align with the kind of morality we prefer. One person will say helping others is morally good because empathy is in our genes, while another might justify aggression or dominance because survival of the fittest is a natural principle. Both are interpretations of nature's facts through a value-laden lens. Nature itself is amoral, it simply is. We humans project our values onto it. Even if science explains why we have moral feelings in terms of neuroscience or evolution, that doesn't make those feelings objectively binding rules. We still choose to embrace or reject what nature gave us. Thus, attempts to derive an ought from what is in nature inevitably sneak in a human perspective. This is exactly what the philosopher David Hume 2007, pointed out with the is-ought problem. You cannot logically derive a moral ought from a factual is without inserting a presupposed value. Well-being as an objective value. Modern moral anti-realism, a contemporary variant of moral naturalism, comes from thinkers who claim we can objectively measure morality by some universal value, like well-being. For instance, neuroscientist Sam Harris has argued, Harris 2010, that morality is really about the maximization of the well-being of conscious creatures. And since science can in principle measure factors that influence well-being, like happiness, suffering, health, etc., moral questions have objective factual answers. At first blush, this sounds promising. Who doesn't want well-being? But here again, a crucial assumption hides in plain sight. That well-being ought to be the ultimate value. Harris essentially hand-picks well-being as the good. But why should we treat that as an objective given, rather than a deeply ingrained preference? One could agree completely that suffering is undesirable, as nearly all of us do, and still point out that this is grounded in our shared subjective experience of pain, not a standalone cosmic decree. We can measure suffering with brain scans or psychological surveys, but no MRI machine will ever spit out a readout that says this is objectively morally wrong, without us already agreeing that suffering matters. It's like measuring the weather. We can objectively say a storm has high wind speeds and low pressure, but calling it a bad storm depends on human concerns. Bad for whom? Relative to what? Likewise, a world full of misery is bad because conscious beings hate misery, not because of an independent moral meter. So even the most science-friendly moral anti-realism sneaks in a value choice, and thereby remains contingent on minds that choose that value. As laudable as the goal of maximizing well-being is, it isn't an objective moral truth handed down from the heavens. It's a moral framework we adopt, because it resonates with our empathetic nature and rational analysis of consequences. We should be clear that we are the ones choosing to elevate well-being as the cardinal value. Doing so is a subjective commitment widely shared, but not a proof of objective morality. In each of these cases, reason, God, nature, or well-being, we see the pattern. An attempt is made to anchor morality in something purportedly bigger than any one individual. But every attempt ends up relying on interpretation and assumptions by conscious minds. Kant had to assume reason's supremacy and interpret what duty requires. Theologians have to interpret divine commands and assume God's goodness. Naturalists have to decide which natural tendencies count as moral. Utilitarians have to define and prioritize well-being. There is no escaping the circle. We are always in the loop. The moment a person says this is an objective moral truth, they must also explain why it is moral and why it is true, and that explanation is their mind at work, framing and justifying a value. The very act of defending a moral claim reveals its contingency. If a moral truth were truly objective, it would need no defense or interpretation. It would shine with self-evidence, unquestioned and identical in every observer's eyes. Clearly, that's not what we encounter in ethics. We encounter debate, diversity of opinion, culturally dependent norms, and evolving attitudes. These are telltale signs that we are dealing not with fixed stars of morality, but with fires lit and tended by us fallible humans. 7.5. The myth of moral absolutes. Belief in objective morality often goes hand in hand with belief in moral absolutes, principles that hold everywhere, for everyone, at all times. Yet history and anthropology provide a sobering counterpoint. What people consider absolute moral truth has changed dramatically from era to era and culture to culture. If morality were truly an objective feature of reality, we would expect it to be constant and universally recognized, much as the boiling point of water or the charge of an electron is the same everywhere. Instead, our species' record is one of moral fluidity. This doesn't mean morality is arbitrary or random. Often there are good reasons for changes, but it does mean moral values are woven from context, not carved from eternal stone. Consider slavery. Today, we view owning another human being as one of the greatest moral wrongs, a violation of fundamental human rights. This stance, we like to think, is obviously true. But for millennia, slavery was not only tolerated, but even deemed morally acceptable and natural by many societies. Philosophers like Aristotle 1998, defended slavery in certain forms. Religions gave it tacit approval or regulated it rather than banning it, and the economy of the ancient and early modern world was built on it. Were all those societies simply ignorant of an eternal moral truth that we moderns finally recognized? If so, objective morality did a terrible job communicating itself for most of human history. A more plausible explanation is that the moral status of slavery changed because we changed, our understanding evolved, empathy expanded, and social structures shifted to make the practice untenable and abhorrent. We, as conscious agents, revised our collective values. This was not the discovery of a pre-existing cosmic law. It was a moral progress rooted in human contingent factors, like recognizing the common humanity of all races, economic changes that made slavery less viable, philosophical arguments about rights and dignity, etc. The same story can be told for many so-called moral truths. The rights of women, once severely limited in most societies, are now widely championed, another radical moral shift within a mere century or two. Attitudes on issues like torture, war, punishment, sexuality, and animal welfare have all undergone transformations over time, and still vary widely across cultures. Even today, there is vast disagreement globally on moral questions. Is capital punishment justified? Is eating meat ethical? Is it ever acceptable to lie? These questions get very different answers depending on whom and where you ask. That is not what we would see if one true morality were beaming down upon us. That is what we see when morality is a human endeavor, contoured by local needs, beliefs, and experiences. Yes, there are some near universal values like fairness, some form of the golden rule, prohibitions on indiscriminate killing. But even those universals are generally interpreted through the lens of cultural narratives. And when conflicts arise between values, different societies rank them differently. Consider freedom versus security, or justice versus mercy. The illusion of moral absolutes is often sustained by looking only within one's own culture or tradition, and assuming those rules are universal. Stepping back reveals a patchwork of moral systems across the world and throughout history. This observation doesn't lead to moral nihilism. Rather, it leads to humility and realism about our moral convictions. We can still believe strongly in our values and fight for what we consider progress. But we do so understanding that we are participants in shaping morality, not passive discoverers of it. In fact, acknowledging the contingency of moral frameworks can foster a more empathetic and open-minded approach. It reminds us that just as our ancestors' certainties now sometimes appall us, some of our certainties may be judged harshly by future generations who develop more enlightened values. One clear emerging example is the moral status of non-human animals and artificial intelligences. Earlier chapters on the spectrum of consciousness argued that consciousness is not a black and white property exclusive to humans, but a spectrum that likely spans many creatures and potentially machines. If we take that seriously, it has direct moral implications. Beings capable of feeling and awareness deserve some degree of moral consideration. Humanity's moral circle has gradually expanded, from tribe to nation to race to all humans, and now it is beginning to widen further to include other sentient beings. What once seemed absolutely acceptable, using animals solely as resources, for instance, is increasingly questioned as we recognize the continuity between their minds and ours. An objectively true morality, if it existed, would have established from the start what beings have moral worth and to what extent. Instead, we see a contingent process of moral inclusion, driven by human insights, arguments, and changing sensibilities. Our moral truths are growing up, not being unveiled. And that growth is guided by us, by our collective reasoning and feeling, rather than by the uncovering of some timeless moral reality. Realizing this liberates us from dogma. We no longer need to pretend that our current moral beliefs are the final truth written into the fabric of the cosmos. We can acknowledge them as the best we have so far, open to revision as we learn more about ourselves, each other, and the world. 7.6 Morality as a human construct and necessary fiction. Stripping away the pretension of objectivity does not leave us in a moral vacuum. On the contrary, it allows us to see ethics for what it truly is, a human-constructed framework that, while not objectively ordained, is vitally important for our lives and societies. This is the paradox we must embrace. Morality is subjective in origin, yet it is also necessary. Once we accept that all moral systems are contingent creations of conscious minds, we can approach ethics pragmatically and constructively, rather than dogmatically. One way to think of morality under existential logicism is to compare it to other large-scale human constructs, like language or money. No one would claim that the English language is an objective feature of the universe. Clearly, it's a product of human culture. Yet, language is undeniably real in its effects and its necessity for communication. It's a shared agreement, constantly evolving, with rules that we more or less arbitrate and update as needed. Similarly, money and economic systems are made up by us, paper bills, digital accounts, market rules, but they serve a function in coordinating society. We treat a dollar as having value, not because of an inherent, objective property, but because everyone collectively accepts the fiction of its value to facilitate trade. Morality, viewed through this lens, is like a social technology. It's a set of rules and values we agree or negotiate upon in order to live together, to reduce conflict, to promote well-being, and to coordinate actions in a complex social world. It might not be true in the sense of mirroring the universe's fabric, but it is profoundly useful and important for us as beings within the universe. Understanding morality as a construct means we can shape it deliberately. We are not bound by some cosmic moral CPU. We are the programmers. Of course, we can't just make up any rules and expect society to flourish. Moral systems are constrained by human nature, by facts of cause and effect, and by logical consistency. But within those bounds, there is flexibility. We can reason together about what values and norms serve our shared interests, and we can update those norms as conditions change or we gain new knowledge. This perspective encourages a healthy moral adaptability. When morality is not viewed as an infallible revelation, we avoid the trap of moral absolutism that justifies atrocities, because it is absolutely right, no matter the cost. Instead, we can always ask, is this moral rule achieving the outcomes we intend? Does it still make sense under current circumstances? If the answer is no, we can change it. Far from plunging us into chaos, a contingent view of ethics can make moral discourse more honest and productive. We stop arguing about who has God or objective truth on their side, and start focusing on tangible impacts and shared values. For example, consider the justice system. If one is convinced punishment has objective moral value as retribution, an eye for an eye as an absolute principle, one might insist on harsh penalties even when they produce more harm than good. But if we see laws and punishments as tools we invented, we can evaluate them by how well they accomplish our aims, such as reducing crime, rehabilitating offenders, or protecting the public, rather than by how well they match some imagined cosmic ledger of justice. This is why many forward-thinking justice reforms emphasize harm reduction, rehabilitation, and prevention over revenge. Those approaches come from treating morality as practical and outcome-oriented, what actually helps people and society, as opposed to what fits an archaic notion of moral desert. In a world without objective sin or cosmic moral scorecards, punishment is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end, and its justification hinges on results and fairness as judged by us, not by the universe. Existential Logicism asserts that we must ground our ethics in reality, specifically in the reality of our human condition, our needs, and the logical consequences of actions, rather than in myths. It is stronger than other views, because it doesn't ask morality to do the impossible, be a magic truth from on high. It asks morality to do what it can do, help conscious agents coexist and thrive. We acknowledge that moral systems are creations of conscious agents designed for coordination and well-being. This realization doesn't weaken morality's importance. It actually makes morality ours. We take ownership of it. Just as a language belongs to its speakers, morality belongs to the community that lives it. And just as languages can be refined to communicate better, our moral systems can be improved to serve us better. We can infuse ethics with reason and compassion, not to discover absolute truth, but to better meet the goals we collectively deem worthy: happiness, reduction of suffering, justice, flourishing, whatever we decide. Importantly, recognizing contingency also imposes a kind of discipline. We can't just claim righteousness by appeal to authority or tradition. We have to justify our moral beliefs with arguments and evidence about their consequences. In a sense, we trade metaphysical legitimacy for practical legitimacy. A moral norm isn't good because it's God's command or a Platonic ideal. It's good because it demonstrably benefits people, respects conscious well-being, or logically follows from principles we've agreed to. This is a more empirical and logical approach to ethics. It aligns with the rest of our understanding of the world. We don't assume truths without evidence elsewhere. So why should we in morality? Granted, unlike physics experiments, moral reasoning often deals with subjective values and predictions about society, but we can still observe outcomes and adapt. For instance, if we adopt a policy that we believe is ethical and it leads to misery or injustice, we have reason to reconsider that policy. In an objective morality framework, one might stubbornly stick to the policy if it was thought to be morally right by decree, even as it causes harm. The contingent approach favors moral experimentation and learning. In summary, morality as a human construct means two key things. One, we created it for our purposes, to foster cooperation, mitigate conflict, and express our shared aspirations. And two, we are responsible for it, for maintaining it, for changing it when needed, and for living up to it since nothing else will enforce it for us. It becomes a kind of necessary fiction, not objectively real, yet necessary to navigate the human experience. Understanding this frees us from chasing moral mirages and lets us focus on what actually matters, making ethical choices that improve lives in the here and now. We can still hold our moral principles dear, but with the wisdom that comes from knowing they are principles we choose and uphold, not commandments etched by the universe. 7.7 Conclusion. Severing the illusion, embracing reality. The Contingency Guillotine delivers a sharp verdict. All moral systems, even those cloaked in the language of universality, are born of minds and depend on minds. The dream of an objective morality, a set of absolute rules that exist independent of any observer, cannot survive this scrutiny. If morality needed no minds, we would find moral truths as unalterable and evident as the laws of physics. Instead, we find moral truths that must be taught, debated, justified, and interpreted. If morality were truly objective, it would be the same for all cultures and eras, but it is not. If it were objective, it would never require defending or interpreting, yet every moral principle comes with commentaries and controversies. In short, if morality were objective, it would not look the way actual morality does. Reality shows us contingent moral beliefs all the way down. By cutting away the illusion of objectivity, we do not destroy morality, We liberate it from false pretenses. What remains is morality understood as a human, and possibly wider than human, phenomenon, flexible, adaptable, and deeply important for conscious beings trying to coexist. Freed from the need to be ultimate, ethics can focus on being effective. This is a cornerstone of the philosophy of existential logicism, confronting comforting illusions with hard logic, and then rebuilding our understanding on a foundation of reason and lived reality. We have seen that moral objectivity was a phantom. Now we replace it with moral responsibility. That is, we accept that it's up to us, our reason, our empathy, our collective decision-making, to craft the best moral framework we can. There is no external guarantee that our morals are correct. There is only the test of time and consequence. Do our principles lead to better lives and less suffering? Do they cohere with our other well-founded knowledge? Those are questions we can answer and continuously refine. Importantly, recognizing the contingency of morality also forces us to grapple with free will and moral responsibility in a new light. If our moral choices are not guided by an external absolute, and if, as earlier chapters have explored, our actions arise from a chain of prior causes and conditions, what does it mean to hold someone accountable? Traditional notions of moral responsibility often presume that individuals are ultimate originators of their actions, free to have done otherwise in an absolute sense. But a logical, deterministic view of the world challenges that assumption. We begin to see bad actions not as transgressions against a cosmic law, but as events caused by a complex interplay of biology, environment, and circumstance. This doesn't mean we abandon the idea of responsibility. It means we redefine it in terms of causality and influence rather than desert and blame. The next chapter, Deterministic Moral Forces, will take up this thread. Building on the Contingency Guillotine, it will examine how morality operates when we acknowledge that human behavior is fully caused, not free from causation, and that our task is to steer those causes toward compassionate outcomes. In a determined universe with no objective moral referee, moral agents become like players in a grand physics of will, where understanding the forces at play can empower us to engineer more ethical societies. Thus, the Contingency Guillotine doesn't leave us in despair. It invites us into a clearer, if more challenging, view of ethical life. We trade the false comfort of absolute moral truth for the authentic responsibility of creating meaning and value through our choices. In doing so, we remain true to the commitments of existential logicism, to face existence as it is, without myths, but with unflinching logic, and to find our guiding principles from that reality. All morality may indeed be subjective, but it is our subjectivity, and therein lies the power. What is contingent can be changed, improved, and continuously aligned with our deepest understanding of the world and ourselves. The guillotine has fallen on objective morality. Now we continue forward, conscious that we alone must carry the banner of ethics, and determined to carry it wisely. Now that morality has been severed from any objective root, we must ask, what grows in its place? This is the final turn, toward a determined, but not meaningless, ethics. 7.8. The Contingency Guillotine. Recap. Why it's the end of objective morality. Before diving into deterministic morality, let's recap why we've abandoned the idea of objective morality in the first place. The Contingency Guillotine is the principle that any moral rule or value that hinges on something changeable, some contingency, cannot be truly objective or universal. In simple terms, if a moral claim depends on any external condition, a human desire, a divine command, a particular outcome, then it's not an independent truth carved into the fabric of the universe. It is contingent, and the guillotine falls, severing its claim to objectivity. David Hume's "Is ought" problem was our starting point. Hume, 2007. David Hume pointed out that you cannot logically derive an ought, a moral prescription, solely from an is, a statement of fact. Traditional moral systems always have to smuggle in some value assumption to bridge the gap. For example, a moral realist might say, suffering is bad, fact. Therefore we ought to reduce suffering, moral duty. But as David Hume noted, the claim that suffering is bad is not a neutral factual statement about the world. It is a value judgment. The Contingency Guillotine makes this even more explicit. Any attempt to claim an objective moral truth runs into the question. Objectively true, according to whom, remove the observer or the context, and the supposed truth evaporates. Let's illustrate the downfall of objective morality. Religious morality claims that moral truths come from a deity. But this is contingent on the existence and nature of that deity. If morality depends on God's command, it's essentially true only given God's preferences. It's not an independent truth of physics or logic. Change or remove the deity, and the moral law changes or disappears. That contingency means it cannot be objective in the philosophical sense. A secular moral anti-realism, for example utilitarianism grounded in well-being, claims that things like pain is bad or happiness is good are objective facts. Yet, as we argued, pain and suffering, while very real experiences, do not carry intrinsic moral weight until we decide they do. Saying pain is bad is a reflection of our human preference to avoid pain, not a statement that the universe magically condemns pain. If an alien with a completely different biology wouldn't agree, then it's not universal. Moral values based on well-being are contingent on human nature and human wants. They make sense for us, but they are not written into the cosmos. Evolutionary or rationalist ethics, some argue morality, could be objective because evolution or pure reason dictates certain behaviors, like cooperation. But again, these are contingent on the particulars of human evolution or on assumptions about what is rational, change the environment, or the premises, and the moral truth changes. In every case, what we call moral truth turns out to be dependent on something else. A mind to value it, a culture to support it, a goal to justify it. This is the contingency guillotine's cut. If a moral law needs anything outside itself to hold true, it is not an independent, objective fact. An objective morality would have to be true in a vacuum, with no contingent factors. But no moral claim meets that standard. Thou shalt not kill sounds absolute, but would that hold as a moral truth in a universe with no living beings? The moment you add, because it causes suffering, or God said so, or society will collapse, you have introduced a contingency. Thus, we concluded that objective morality is an illusion. There is no external, context-free source of right and wrong. Morality is inherently a human, or at least mind-dependent, construct. But this does not mean morality doesn't exist or that we should succumb to chaos. It just means morality must be understood in different terms. If not objective, what is it? The answer: morality is a construct that arises from the deterministic nature of reality and human beings within it. It is a product of facts, not an escape from them. To get there, we first need to examine the role of determinism and the myth of free will, because the death of objective morality and the birth of a deterministic ethics are deeply intertwined. 7.9 Existential Logicism's final pillar: all morality, behavior, and even punishment are products of deterministic forces. In the aftermath of the contingency guillotine, we find ourselves in a moral landscape stripped of any objective, preordained law. The previous chapter dismantled the illusion of an absolute morality by showing that every ought ultimately rests on a contingent human value or assumption. With that objective foundation cut away, we now turn to what fills the void. Deterministic moral forces is the answer, a framework asserting that morality is not a divine command or cosmic truth, but an emergent product of cause and effect. This final pillar of existential logicism argues that all our moral judgments, behaviors, and systems of justice flow from deterministic processes. In other words, morality is not something we choose freely or discover in nature, but something we inevitably produce, given the way reality is structured. This following chapter will build directly on the previous insights. Having accepted that there is no objective moral law handed down from on high, we embrace a deterministic ethical framework rooted in real-world consequences. We will explore the illusion of free will and how it has distorted our notions of praise, blame, and just deserts. We will see that even as we strive to act morally, our actions are wholly shaped by causality. Our choices are choices in name only, unfolding from prior events. Paradoxically, by accepting this, we do not undermine morality, but reinforce it. A determined morality can still guide us, more effectively in fact, because it is grounded in reality. We will also introduce how this framework resolves the infamous is-ought divide in a novel way. This is not presented as some grand new moral commandment, but as a natural consequence of existential logicism's structure. A compelling byproduct that shows how ought can be rooted in is once we view morality through the lens of determinism. Along the way, we'll use practical examples like the classic trolley problem to illustrate how a deterministic view brings moral clarity that traditional systems, whether based on objective rules or retributive instincts, lack. We will argue that retributive punishment becomes irrational even on its own terms, especially once one acknowledges the causal forces behind behavior. And throughout, we'll reinforce the vision of moral structure not as a top-down decree or a matter of subjective whim, but as an emergent pattern of deterministic systems interacting. By the end of the next chapter, the aim is to see morality in a new light, not as a mysterious absolute or a mere personal preference, but as a determined functional construct, real and necessary, yet entirely born from the interplay of cause and effect. 7.10 Formal derivation for the contingency guillotine. In this appendix, we make explicit the logical core of the contingency guillotine. Contingency guillotine. The informal chapter argued that no moral claim can be strongly objective, in the way that, say, 2 + 2 = 4, or this particle has charge, E are objective. Every genuinely moral claim is, on analysis, contingent on one or more valuers. We now state this precisely. Definition: 7.1 Valuer. A valuer is any subsystem V of reality that 1 instantiates a non-trivial ordering V over a domain SV of accessible world states or internal states, and 2 whose dynamics are systematically sensitive to that ordering, in the sense that, ceteris paribus, V tends to move towards states SV with SVS, and away from, with SVS. We write val V when V is such a subsystem. Intuitively, valuerhood is the minimal structure needed for something to have better and worse states for it, and to behave in a way that tracks this. Definition 7.2. Moral proposition. A proposition P is moral if its content essentially employs moral vocabulary: good, bad, right, wrong, ought, etc. In an action-guiding sense, that is, P purports not merely to describe patterns, but to evaluate states or actions and to license or forbid behaviors on that basis. We write moral P when P is moral in this sense. This excludes purely sociological claims like most people in society X disapprove of lying, a descriptive generalization, while including claims like you ought not lie or killing is wrong. Definition 7.3. Strongly objective moral proposition. Let W be a space of possible worlds, understood in the usual model theoretic sense. A moral proposition P with moral. P is strongly objective if 1. For every world WW, P has a determinate truth value in W, and 2. The truth value of P in W is independent of A, whether any value exists in W, and B, the structural features of any values that do exist in W, their orderings, sensitivities, etc. We write obj more P when P is a strongly objective moral proposition. Strong objectivity here is the view from nowhere notion. P is true or false in each world, regardless of which minds, if any, inhabit that world. We now capture the core observation of the Contingency Guillotine chapter, Lemma 7.1, hidden value in moral content. Let P be a proposition with moral P. Then, in any world W in which P is interpreted with its ordinary moral force, as action-guiding and evaluative, the interpretation of P presupposes the existence of at least one valuer in W proof. By definition 7.2, a moral proposition B uses vocabulary such as good, bad, right, wrong, or ought in a way that evaluates states or actions and guides behavior. For such vocabulary to have non-degenerate content, it must pick out an ordering of states as better, worse, for someone or something, and a corresponding push on action, for example, do what is right, avoid the bad. If we try to interpret P in a world W containing no subsystem that 1. Orders states as better, worse, and 2. Is behaviorally constrained by that ordering, then there is no structure in W for the moral vocabulary to latch onto. Labels like wrong and ought become bare annotations with no answer to the questions wrong for whom, or ought relative to what goal or standard. Thus, in any world where P has its usual moral content, there must exist at least one subsystem V, instantiating a non-trivial preference ordering and being guided by it. That is, there exists V such that val V holds. This is exactly what definition 7.1 requires. Hence, the interpretation of P as a moral proposition presupposes the existence of at least one valuer in W. The next step makes explicit what happens in worlds lacking valuers altogether. Lemma 7.2, moral vocabulary collapses in value-free worlds. Let P be a proposition with moral P. Consider a world W, in which no valuer exists, that is, val V in W, then either 1. Has no determinate truth value in W, its truth conditions fail to be instantiated, or 2. P is reinterpreted as a purely descriptive claim, losing its status as a moral proposition that is moral P fails in W. Proof. By Lemma 7.1, the ordinary moral interpretation of P presupposes at least one valuer. In a world W with no valuer, this presupposition fails. Case 1. We insist on retaining the moral reading of P. Then, because the necessary background structure, valuers, is absent, no state of W can satisfy the conditions under which P would count as true or false. The result is that P lacks a determinate truth value in W. The world is simply not the kind of structure in which P can be evaluated as moral. Case 2, instead, we reinterpret P and W as a purely descriptive statement. For example, most organisms in worlds like ours disapprove of lying, that no longer plays an action-guiding, evaluative role in W. Under that reinterpretation, moral P is false in W, since P no longer functions as a moral proposition by definition 7.2. In neither case do we have P retaining determinate, action-guiding moral truth in W without any valuer. Thus, moral vocabulary either becomes truth-valueless or ceases to be moral in valuer-free worlds. We can now state the Contingency Guillotine as a theorem. Theorem 7.3, the Contingency Guillotine, for any proposition P with moral. P is not strongly objective, that is, obj more P. Proof. Suppose, for contradiction, that P is a moral proposition, moral P, and that obj more P holds. By definition 7.3, this means 1. For every world WWP has a determinate truth value in W, and 2. The truth value of P in W is independent of the existence and structure of any values in W. Consider a world W0W in which no value exists, V-val V in W. Such a world is allowed by the quantification over W. By lemma 7.2 in was 0 either 1. P has no determinate truth value, or 2. P is not a moral proposition. It is reinterpreted as non-moral descriptive content. Option 1 contradicts condition 1 of strong objectivity, which requires P to have a determinate truth value in every world. Option 2 contradicts the assumption that P is moral in W0, that is, that moral P is globally applicable. Thus, our supposition that P is both moral and strongly objective leads to a contradiction. Therefore, no moral proposition P is strongly objective, that is, obj more P, for all P with moral P. In words, once we insist on moral terms having their ordinary action-guiding meaning, their truth conditions cannot be detached from the existence and structure of values. Moral facts, if any, are necessarily value-dependent. Corollary 7.4. No mind-independent moral facts. There are no moral facts whose truth is independent of all valuers. Equivalently, in any world where moral propositions are true or false, their truth is contingent on the existence and structure of one or more valuers in that world. Proof. Immediate from Theorem 7.3 and Definition 7.3. If there were a mind-independent moral fact, it would be expressed by some moral proposition P that is strongly objective, contradicting Theorem 7.3. Remark 7.5. Relation to David Hume's is ought. David Hume's is ought point notes that no set of purely descriptive premises about how the world is logically entails a prescriptive conclusion about what one ought to do, without some value assumption entering. The Contingency Guillotine goes further. It does not merely say that values are needed somewhere in the premises, it shows that even the content of moral conclusions is conceptually anchored in values. Once you attempt to strip moral predicates of all reference to any valuer, their normative force evaporates, and they cease to function as moral at all. Remark 7.6. Guillotine test and familiar realisms. The informal chapter described a rock star zombie test for alleged objective moral principles. The formal result here explains why that test works. When someone asserts, for example, pain is objectively bad or killing is wrong independently of any mind, they either wrong. Unpack bad. Wrong in terms of how valuers like us are structured, for example, avoidance of suffering, stability of. Cooperation, in which case the claim is explicitly value-dependent and not strongly objective, or 2. Insist on a valuer-free sense of bad. Wrong that is supposed to apply in worlds without any valuers, in which case, by lemma 7.2, the vocabulary loses its moral content, or fails to have determinate truth. This applies equally to divine command theories, which make wrongness contingent on a particular mind's preferences, rationalist ethics, which build values into the definition of a rational will, and well-being realisms, which assume agents who care about well-being. In all cases, the apparent objectivity is either a description of stable convergence among valuers of a given type, or a pseudo-option that collapses once valuers are removed. Remark 7.7. Bridge to deterministic morality. Corollary 7.4 does not entail that morality is illusory or unimportant. It entails that moral structure is an emergent feature of deterministic interactions among valuers in reality, not a set of laws imposed from outside reality. The deterministic morality framework, deterministic moral forces, developed in the subsequent chapter takes this as its starting point. Once we accept that all normativity is value-dependent and that values themselves are fully caused systems, moral theory becomes the study of how such systems behave and how we can shape those behaviors to reduce suffering and improve the lives of beings like us. Chapter 8, Deterministic Morality. Pillar 7,